Welcome to Kursipanas, Episode 4. After nomination day, I turned to Selangor. Anyone watching Malaysia's state elections knows that Selangor is the hot area. It's the prize that Perikatan Nasional, the opposition, would like to win. But in order to understand their chances, one has to look at individual seats. And it's in this regard that I've chosen the seat of Kuala Kubu Baru, or KKB as it is affectionately known. Located about 60 kilometers north of Kuala Lumpur, in the parliamentary constituency of Ulu Selangor, KKB has a very interesting history. Geographically, it's been close to the Selangor River and the Selangor Dam, and that has impacted the town. In fact, it was flooding from the Selangor River when the dam burst that eventually led to the town being created and moved to KKB, the Baru part. KKB is one of the few and the first garden towns in Asia. This was created in the 1920s. When you go to the town, you see the beautiful buildings. There's a sense of significant town planning that went into creating the area. It's also a place of interesting history. It traces its name back to the Selangor Civil War from 1867 to 1874. Two different factions were fighting to control Selangor. One of the factions, led by a man called Raja Mahadi, built a fort near the mouth of the river, near Kuala Kubu. Eventually, Raja Mahadi's faction lost. But a member of his faction, a man called Sahid Mansor, came back to become one of the Pengurus in the area. And his family has played an important role in terms of linking back the town historically to the struggles for Malay power and tying it back into the importance of Selangor itself. The history of KKB is very closely connected to that of Selangor. It became an old tin mining town. It was once the third largest town in Selangor. It's the place that there was the first federal road that was built, the Gateway to Pahang. In fact, it's that same road where infamously Henry Gurney was assassinated in 1955 that began the struggle and the emergency period. KKB has long known and had international prominence. In 1937 and again in 1946, Jawaharlal Nehru visited to engage the Indian community in this area. And of course, this particular area has been a focus point of writers and songwriters and singers. The most famous book about KKB is that of Rehman Rashid. Rehman Rashid was a writer, a journalist. Earlier in his life, he was a civil servant and an academic. He was perhaps one of the most brilliant observers of Malaysia. In 2016, he wrote a personal tribute to KKB, one of the last books before he died in 2017. He lived in KKB for over 20 years. Anyone who reads Rehman Rashid's work, the books that he's written, I highly recommend: A Malaysian Journey, Peninsula, Story of Malaysia, and of course, the book Small Town, a tribute to KKB. All of these books really capture the essence of a transforming country, the tensions of being a Malaysian. Rehman Rashid dealt with questions of identity in his book. You could see these in very real ways in all of his books. He was a man of mixed identity, Eurasian and Indian Muslim, and his observations were often shared through his own personal history. He wrestles with the questions of being a multicultural country, what it means to be Malaysian. He was a real, true person who believed in Malaysia, the story, the practice, the communities, the multiracialism. His books also capture the profound generational changes of people engaging with political shifts, socioeconomic shifts, and lifestyle shifts. He spoke about KKB not only in the book Small Town, but also in Peninsula, The Story of Malaysia. Allow me to share with you what he wrote. I consider this place a living showcase of the peninsula in its better aspect, from geography and history to society and politics. Perhaps I want to believe this all the most after 23 years of considering this place my home. I think we are well and good here. The landscape of Ulu Selangor is too enfolded in these hills for anything imposed on it from above, not to be infused by what lies beneath. Rehman Rashid believed very much in the core and the foundation that lay beneath. His focus on the small town, the core of Malaysia, the heart of Malaysia, where there are multiracial communities living side by side, in true sense of community, was perhaps one of the important legacies of his work. He talked about a sense of place, a sense of heritage, a sense of changing and shifting identities. The book captures his love of KKP very well. And when you go to this small town, as you do with many other small towns across Malaysia, some of my favorite places are the small towns, you really get a sense that you've come to a home. KKB is quietly bustling, not with an intensity of rushing around, but more people going about their lives in a way that has a sense of connectivity. In the core of the town, there's a happiness shop. There's also wonderful food places that have their roots for many generations. I stopped by a place that sells kaya buns and durian cake, both of which were delicious. And I also had a chance to sit down with voters at a coffee shop, or should we say a mamak place, where I shared and discussed the political dynamics in KKB. The question in this election is whether or not the outside will actually get through that foundation that Raymond Rashid talks about. Will it come and change the fabric of what's happening in a small town? KKB has long been a political contestation between the DAP and the MCA, with other communities and other contests such as UMNO and other parties seen as not the place where this was happening, seen as on the periphery. So the Indian and Malay community haven't had that same level of political mobilization and contestation. While, of course, they vote across races, there still has been a sense that this is a particular battle among the Chinese community. You can see that there's some parts of the communities, the Indians and the Malays, where they haven't had that same kind of connection to the political system because that seat in that area has not been, quote unquote, their fight. And in fact, worryingly, there's been some pockets of neglect in places like Lembah Beringan, for example, where this particular community living largely Malays, it was supposed to become a proton city. But after the 1997 financial crisis, it never took off. So you can see there's a sense that it's been almost left behind. This combination of modern and behind are actually two very interesting features of what is happening in the context of KKB. In many ways, the contest will test the multiracial fabric and the nature of small towns in terms of the connectivity. There are actually a number of very interesting features about KKB politically in this really hot seat of 24,000 voters. First of which will be the question of the test of loyalties. So you have a Perikatan Nasional candidate who's a Chinese candidate who is trying to win the support of the Malay community. He's really hoping that Perikatan Nasional support will move to his direction. We also have a candidate that's now working under the flag of PRM who was an old DAP stalwart. He managed and was the chairman of the DAP in KKP. He will also tap into some of the traditional base, especially in the older generation of DAP voters. Pakatan Harapan is slating its own incumbent. And so the question will also be how loyal DAP are to an incumbent that has been chosen by the party, where many inside the party were hoping that there would be a new candidate. The candidate was, in fact, ill for some time, and as a consequence, there wasn't the same level of connectivity to the electorate, which created a lot of grievances. And then, of course, we have a new party, MUDA, who is also contesting. This is a test of whether or not he will be able to pull voters from his ethnic communities and across from younger voters. The Perikatan Nasional candidate is a man called Teo Kin Hong. He's 44. He's a member of Gerakan, and he's been part of the Gerakan communications head for Selangor. He actually has a history of being involved in social activities, and he's been very active in criticizing the DAP, setting in the context for him to contest in this election. We see the DAP stalwart is a man called Cheng Boon Lai. He is 65, and he's contesting under the Parti Rakyat Malaysia. He was, as I mentioned, the chairman of DAP's KKP branch. And of course, there's been a lot of these tensions within the party because Cheng was sacked, and of course, he was seen as challenging the incumbent. The incumbent is a woman, Lee Ki-hyung. She's 58. She was, in her early days, a special officer to Lim Kit Siang in the 90s. She later became a municipal councilor from 2008 to 2013. She's been a longtime member of the DEP. She's been in the assembly since 2013. She is now seeking her third term. The fourth candidate is a man called Siva Prakash Ramasamy. He's contesting under the Muda banner. He's 41 years old. He has a PhD in business management, and he has been seen as being active on issues of education, and he's been highlighting politically the issues of the Indian community and also sort of a different plan for questions of development. These particular competing loyalties are very fascinating. At one level, do you vote along racial lines, or on the other hand, do you vote on political party lines? Is it based on your personal ties? These are tensions that were real when I spoke to voters. I went to a more remote area to discuss with some of the Indian community that were living near this estate how they felt about the upcoming election. There was a sense that, as I've mentioned earlier, that they felt they did not have a voice. They were looking to Dr. Siva as a potential person who would be able to channel some of their concerns. And of course, they felt a sense of connectivity. But at the same time, they were also concerned whether or not those voices and those issues that would be able to have deliverables in this regard. The voting patterns provide some interesting lenses of what's happened in KKB in the past. We can see that there has been ethnic splitting in the votes. 91% of the Chinese community voted for Pakatan Harapan, but it was only 64% of the Indian community did, which is a bit lower than the average in Selangor compared to other seats which have a large section of Indians. Indian community and the Indian voters are 18% of the seat. The Chinese are actually 31%, and the Malays are 48%. The Malay vote is also quite interesting. Pakatan Harapan captured 21% of it, but increasingly the Perikatan Nasional captured much more. And this goes to the fact that PN has been very effective in these semi-urban and rural areas of garnering support in Selangor, making Selangor a much more competitive state than it was. So the question becomes, how will the candidate factor and the party candidate come together and be a synergy? Will the Malay voters move towards Gerakan just because it has a PN label? And you can see in the constituency, there are not that many pictures of the PN candidate, but more the PN flag. In the case of the Indian voters, which are concentrated in certain communities, will Dr. Siva be able to capture some of those? And will the split in the Chinese vote impact the numbers? We can see that these particular communities have had very different sets of patterns of voting, and those will become interesting to see how they're being mobilized. The Malay community, which is the largest share at 48%, will be decisive in shaping the outcome. Although many I spoke to, many Malay voters, were more ambivalent in their assessment. Some of them were not considering voting at all, and others didn't feel that even with a representation of a PN candidate, this would actually mean anything substantive for them. I sat down and had tea with a group of senior Hajis who are part of the pension community that have tea in the afternoon, and their perceptions were very varied. Of the 5 of them, one of them wasn't considering voting, one of them didn't even know who the candidates were. Other 2 knew where the candidates were, but they weren't sure what was going to be able to have it an outcome for them. And there was a sense that they wasn't sure how much this election was going to impact and change their lives. But eventually they said they would vote. One of those voters already had decided they would vote for PN. So this ambivalence, this sense of lack of connectivity, a lack of sense of kind of decisiveness is very telling. And part of the conversation came up that another very important point besides ethnic voting is the role and the significance of the Selangor government. It had been some time that I had been in KKB. So when I came back driving along the road, a bit slow after many lorries, we saw, in some construction, but we got there, we saw a situation where we could see the presence of the Selangor government was very different than before. You have a much more connectivity with an established bus system. You have a recycling system. You have a situation where there has been kind of the expansion and support for ecotourism. And it was fascinating that, unlike other parts of Malaysia, it was Amiruddin, the chief minister, the Menteri Besar, whose picture was on the photos and the posters. So it is the sense that the Selangor was actually being tested in its governance, more so than we find in other parts of Malaysia. In this constituency, multiracial that it is, the small town, the question of whether or not the outside is coming in, imposing its narratives, is very much a salient one. The question of what's inside at the bedrock, what is the nature of the small town, is also very real. Will voters in KKB vote along ethnic lines? Will the quality of representation of all the communities strengthen? Rehman Rashid believed that KKB brought out the better. He believed that the town and its people could weather the storms, the social ties, the trust. He believed in the essence of being Malaysian in a multiracial society. Malay singer Sudirman Haji Arshad once wrote a tribute to this particular place of KKB. Kalau pergi Kuala Kubu, tulis nama atas batu. Of course, he sung it much better than I would. If you go to a Kuala Kubu, write your name on a rock. We'll see, come election day, who is written name on the rock. This seat remains a hot seat, one of the few for DAP in Selangor, but it is indeed panas, despite the place being a wonderful, cool